Mythical gorillas. For most of recorded Western history, the existence of gorillas was not treated as zoology. It was treated as folklore. Reports described beings that were too large, too strong, and too human to fit comfortably within accepted knowledge of the natural world. They were said to live deep in equatorial forests, covered in hair, capable of extraordinary violence, and prone to beating their chests in displays of dominance. To European scholars, these accounts sounded less like animals and more like distorted echoes of ancient myths about wild men and monsters. The earliest surviving written reference appears in a text attributed to Hanno the Navigator, a Carthaginian explorer who sailed along the West African coast sometime in the 5th century BCE. In his account, later preserved in Greek translation and known as the Periplus of Hanno, he describes encountering a group of creatures called gorillae. They are depicted as large, hairy, and fiercely aggressive. According to the text, Hanno's expedition captured several females, but they fought so violently that they were killed. Their skins were taken back to Carthage and reportedly displayed in a temple for centuries. Ancient and medieval scholars did not read this account as a zoological observation. Instead, it was folded into a category of creatures that included satyrs, cynocephaly, and other beings thought to occupy the border between humanity and monstrosity. The descriptions seemed implausible. No known animal fit the profile, and the idea of a powerful, man-like creature living unseen in Africa's interior was incompatible with the classical worldview that assumed most large land animals were already known. By the 18th century, natural historians had formal systems for classifying life. Apes were known. Chimpanzees and orangutans had been described, but the gorilla remained conspicuously absent. Reports of a much larger ape were treated with suspicion. Without physical evidence, there was no incentive to revise established taxonomy. The stories were quietly grouped with other persistent but unverified claims, relics of an era when travelers mistook imagination for observation. That changed in the mid-19th century. In 1847, an American missionary and physician named Thomas Stoughton Savage received several skulls from West Africa. Unlike any known ape, these skulls showed massive jaw muscles, pronounced brow ridges, and a cranial capacity distinct from chimpanzees. Savage and the anatomist Jeffries Wyman formally described the species, naming it gorilla, deliberately reviving the ancient term used by Hanno over 2,000 years earlier. Skepticism did not vanish overnight. Some scientists initially argued the skulls belonged to malformed humans or an exaggerated variety of known apes. It was only after additional skeletal material and, eventually, whole specimens reached Europe that doubt collapsed. By the 1850s, the gorilla was no longer a rumor. It was officially recognized as the largest living primate on Earth. The realization forced a re-evaluation of earlier accounts. Descriptions once dismissed as fantasy aligned closely with observed gorilla behavior. Chest beating, immense physical strength, territorial displays, and social groupings all matched the mythical reports. What had seemed like monstrous embellishment turned out to be a surprisingly accurate portrayal filtered through unfamiliar cultural lenses. In retrospect, the gorilla was not a myth that inspired discovery. It was a discovery that arrived too late to rescue the myth from disbelief. For most of human history, one of the planet's most powerful animals was treated as a creature of imagination. And when proof finally emerged, it revealed that the line between legend and reality had never been as clear as scholars once believed. Amazon warriors real. For centuries, the Amazons occupied a peculiar place in Western imagination. Greek literature described them as a fearsome society of women who lived beyond the edges of the known world, masters of archery and horseback warfare, and formidable enough to challenge heroes like Heracles, Achilles, and Theseus. They were portrayed as outsiders to Greek civilization, independent, violent, and resistant to male authority. To later historians, this sounded symbolic rather than literal. The Amazons were widely interpreted as a myth, a narrative device used by Greek writers to explore anxieties about gender, order, and the boundaries of civilization. Classical authors placed the Amazon somewhere to the northeast of the Greek world, in regions bordering the Black Sea. Herodotus associated them with the Scythians, nomadic peoples who roamed the Eurasian steppe. But for generations, this geographical precision did little to convince scholars. The stories seemed exaggerated. Claims that Amazon women removed a breast to better draw a bow were treated as proof of fictionalization, not anatomy. Without physical evidence, the Amazons were classified alongside centaurs and other mythic constructs. That assessment began to unravel in the late 20th century. Archaeologists working across modern-day Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan started excavating Scythian and Sarmatian burial mounds, known as kurgans. These were not modest graves. They were elaborate tombs containing weapons, armor, horses, and ceremonial goods. What surprised researchers was not the richness of the burials, but the identity of the individuals inside them. A significant number of these graves belonged to women. Osteological analysis confirmed biological sex, and the accompanying artifacts were unmistakable. Bows, quivers filled with arrows, spears, swords, and dag_attachers were buried alongside female skeletons. In many cases, the bones themselves told a clearer story. Healed fractures, embedded arrowheads, and trauma consistent with combat were present. These were not symbolic weapons. They were the tools of experienced fighters. The distribution of these graves mattered. They were found precisely in the regions Greek writers had associated with Amazon centuries earlier. The alignment between text and archaeology was difficult to dismiss. While no evidence suggests an all-female society, the data revealed something equally disruptive to long-held assumptions. There were cultures in which women regularly rode into battle, hunted, and fought alongside men. Further analysis showed that these women were not anomalies. In some Scythian populations, as many as 1 in 3 warrior graves belonged to females. Their lifestyles required strength, endurance, and training from a young age. Horse riding left distinct marks on the pelvis and femur. Archery reshaped shoulder joints. These physical adaptations were present regardless of sex. The Amazons, it turned out, were not invented from nothing. Greek storytellers exaggerated, moralized, and mythologized what they heard. But beneath the layers of symbolism was a historical reality. Warrior women existed on the Eurasian steppe, visible enough to leave an imprint on one of the world's most influential mythologies. What was once dismissed as fantasy now reads like distorted reportage, preserved long enough for the ground itself to confirm it. Siberian Unicorn. For most of human history, the unicorn existed in a strange space between belief and ridicule. Ancient texts described a powerful, solitary creature with a single horn, roaming distant lands beyond familiar borders. To medieval Europeans, it became a symbol, pure, elusive, and impossibly graceful. To later scholars, it became a joke. By the modern era, the unicorn was firmly categorized as fantasy, grouped with dragons and phoenixes, a creature invented to satisfy myth and metaphor rather than observation. But the problem with the unicorn myth was never the horn. It was the assumption that ancient people were always inventing rather than reporting. Long before fairy tales softened its image, writers from Greece, Rome, Persia, and China all mention massive, one-horned beasts. The Greek historian Ctesias, writing in the 4th century BCE, described a powerful animal from the east with a single horn and immense strength. His account was dismissed for centuries as hearsay layered with exaggeration. That dismissal began to weaken in the 19th and 20th centuries as paleontologists excavated the frozen plains of Eurasia. What they uncovered was not a delicate horse-like creature, but the fossilized remains of Elasmotherium sibericum. This animal, now commonly called the Siberian unicorn, was a species of prehistoric rhinoceros that lived across what is now Russia, Kazakhstan, and parts of Eastern Europe. It was enormous. Estimates suggest it could weigh up to 4 tons, with a thick, muscular body built for endurance rather than speed. Its defining feature was a single, massive horn growing from the center of its forehead. While the horn itself was made of keratin and did not fossilize, the skull shows an enormous base, indicating a structure far larger than that of any modern rhinoceros. This was not a decorative appendage. It was a functional weapon. For decades, scientists believed Elasmotherium went extinct around 350,000 years ago, far too early to have influenced human myth. That assumption changed in 2018, when radiocarbon dating of a skull revealed the species survived until at least 39,000 years ago. This placed it squarely within the time frame of early modern humans moving through Eurasia. Humans and unicorns, it turned out, overlapped. The animal's appearance would have been startling. Covered in thick hair to survive Ice Age climates, standing taller than modern rhinos, and bearing a single horn that could exceed several feet in length, it would have looked less like a fairy tale creature and more like a moving fortress. Seen from a distance, or described across generations, its form could easily shift from beast to legend. The unicorn was never a dainty invention. It was a memory, blurred by time, reshaped by culture, and eventually romanticized beyond recognition. When fossils finally surfaced, they revealed an uncomfortable truth. One of history's most mocked myths was grounded in a real animal. It just wasn't magical. It was massive, dangerous, and very real. Stone Age surgery. For much of modern history, prehistoric medicine was assumed to be primitive to the point of futility. Stone Age humans were imagined as incapable of complex intervention, especially when it came to the most delicate organ in the body. The idea that they could perform anything resembling brain surgery was treated as absurd. Yet scattered across museums and excavation sites around the world are skulls that force a different conclusion, one that is difficult to dismiss. The procedure is known as trepanation, sometimes spelled trephination. It involved deliberately creating an opening in the skull by scraping, cutting, or drilling away bone. The tools were simple: sharpened flint, obsidian blades, or stone scrapers. The locations of these openings were not random. They were carefully placed, often avoiding major sutures and structurally weak areas, suggesting anatomical awareness gained through experience rather than chance. What transformed trepanation from speculation into evidence was bone healing. Many of the skulls show clear signs of osteogenic regrowth around the edges of the opening. This process takes time. In some cases, months. In others, years. The implication is unavoidable. These individuals survived the procedure and lived long enough for their skulls to partially or fully heal. Examples of trepanation have been found on every inhabited continent, with the oldest known cases dating back more than 7,000 years. In Neolithic Europe, particularly in what is now France, dozens of skulls display trepanation marks. Similar findings appear in the Andes, where pre-Columbian cultures practiced the procedure extensively. In some regions of ancient Peru, survival rates appear to have exceeded 60%, rivaling outcomes of much later surgical periods. Why the procedure was performed remains a subject of careful debate. Some skulls show evidence of prior trauma, such as depressed fractures, suggesting trepanation was used to relieve pressure after head injuries. Others show no sign of trauma at all. This has led researchers to consider alternative explanations, including treatment for chronic headaches, seizures, or neurological disorders like epilepsy. Ethnographic parallels from later cultures suggest trepanation was also believed to release harmful forces believed to cause illness. What is striking is the apparent control involved. The brain itself was rarely damaged. The scraping technique, in particular, removed bone gradually, reducing the risk of penetrating the dura mater. This implies not only trial and error, but accumulated procedural knowledge passed between generations. There is no evidence these operations were symbolic or performed only after death. The healing proves otherwise. These were living patients who endured invasive cranial surgery without anesthesia, antiseptics, or metal instruments, and survived. Trepanation challenges the assumption that technological simplicity equals intellectual limitation. Stone Age societies lacked writing, but they possessed empirical knowledge rooted in observation and repetition. They understood the skull well enough to open it without killing the person inside. What appears terrifying by modern standards reveals something else when viewed without condescension. Long before hospitals, long before textbooks, humans were already experimenting with the limits of survival. And in many cases, they succeeded. Mocha Dick. Long before Moby-Dick became a staple of American literature, sailors in the Pacific were already telling stories about a whale that did not behave like other whales. It was enormous, pale in color, and unusually aggressive. Among whalers, it was known as Mocha Dick, named after Mocha Island off the coast of Chile, where it was most frequently sighted. To those who encountered it, the animal was not a metaphor or a symbol. It was a recurring, physical threat. The earliest detailed account of Mocha Dick appeared in 1839, published by the American writer and explorer Jeremiah Reynolds in the Knickerbocker magazine. Reynolds described an albino sperm whale of exceptional size, easily recognizable by its white coloration and scarred body. According to whalers, the scars were the result of repeated encounters with hunting crews. By some estimates, the whale had survived dozens of harpoon strikes over many years. What made Mocha Dick unusual was not just its appearance, but its behavior. Sperm whales typically attempted to flee once attacked. Mocha Dick reportedly did the opposite. Multiple accounts claimed the whale would turn toward whaling boats, smashing them with its head or tail. These stories circulated widely within the whaling community, passed between crews as warnings rather than entertainment. The animal became infamous, a known hazard in an already dangerous profession. Reynolds' account treated Mocha Dick as a real, documented creature, not a sailor's exaggeration. He included specific locations, repeated sightings, and descriptions from independent crews. While the dramatic tone reflected the style of the era, modern historians generally agree that such a whale existed. Albino sperm whales are rare but biologically plausible, and aggressive defensive behavior under sustained hunting pressure is consistent with known animal responses. Herman Melville was familiar with Reynolds' writing. He had worked aboard whaling ships himself and was immersed in maritime lore. When Moby-Dick was published in 1851, readers recognized the resemblance immediately. The fictional whale shared the same coloration, near-mythical reputation, and reputation for destroying ships. Melville's version added philosophical depth and symbolism, but its foundation was unmistakably real. It is important to note that Mocha Dick was not the sole inspiration. Another major influence was the 1820 sinking of the whaleship Essex, rammed by a sperm whale in the Pacific. Together, these events formed a factual backdrop that made Melville's story feel disturbingly plausible to contemporary audiences. Mocha Dick was eventually killed, reportedly by a large group of whalers who encountered it late in its life. Its death marked the end of a legend, but not the end of its impact. What remained was the unsettling realization that one of literature's most famous monsters was not born purely from imagination. It emerged from real encounters between humans and an animal that refused to behave as expected. In that sense, Moby Dick was not a fantasy. It was a dramatized memory of something that actually swam the oceans. Caligula's barges. For centuries, the Roman Emperor Caligula was remembered as a figure of excess and madness. Ancient sources described him as unpredictable, cruel, and lavish to extremes that strained credibility. Among the most extraordinary claims was that he had commissioned enormous floating palaces on Lake Nemi, small volcanic lakes nestled in the hills near Rome. According to historical accounts, these were not mere pleasure boats, but colossal vessels equipped with marble floors, mosaic decorations, and plumbing systems capable of supplying hot and cold running water. They were, in effect, floating villas designed to host banquets, games, and extravagant spectacles. For nearly 2 millennia, historians dismissed these reports as exaggeration, another symptom of Caligula's reputed insanity. The idea that an emperor could command the construction of engineering feats so vast and luxurious, especially on a modestly sized lake, seemed impossible. Ancient writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio documented the claims, but without physical evidence, the stories were treated as literary hyperbole. tales meant to illustrate moral lessons about hubris and corruption rather than factual history. That assessment began to change in the early 20th century. Between 1929 and 1932, the Italian archaeologist Guido Uccelli undertook a project to partially drain Lake Nemi. As the waters receded, the remains of two massive ships emerged from the mud and silt. These were not small boats. They measured more than 70 meters in length and were remarkably sophisticated for the 1st century CE. Woodwork, metal fittings, and the remnants of decorative mosaics confirmed what the ancient texts had claimed. Caligula's vessels were real, and they were engineered on a scale that challenged modern assumptions about Roman naval architecture. The hulls were fitted with complex systems for stability, ballast, and water management. Pipes and conduits indicated that hot and cold water could be directed through baths and fountains on board. Evidence of living quarters, banquet halls, and storage spaces suggests that the ships were intended for extended use rather than simple ceremonial purposes. These floating palaces were fully functional vessels and simultaneously extravagant displays of imperial power and wealth. Scholars now recognize that Caligula's barges were not mere symbols of excess, but remarkable achievements of Roman engineering and ingenuity. Their existence forces a reconsideration of the historical record, showing that some of the most outlandish claims about his reign were grounded in reality. Caligula's reputation for madness may have exaggerated his eccentricities, but the evidence of these floating palaces confirms that he combined ambition, extravagance, and technological daring on a scale previously thought impossible. The recovered ships were later destroyed during World War II, but archaeological documentation, photographs, and surviving artifacts preserve the evidence of their existence. What was once dismissed as myth is now an undeniable testament to one of history's most infamous emperors, a man whose vision of luxury literally floated above the waters of a quiet Roman lake. Necropolis Railway. For nearly a century, London had a transportation system unlike any other, a railway line dedicated entirely to the dead. The London Necropolis Railway was established in the mid-19th century, during a period when the city was facing a severe crisis of overcrowded burial grounds. By the 1850s, churchyards were bursting at the seams. Graves were shallow, decomposing bodies threatened wells, and epidemics of cholera and other diseases made it clear that urgent action was required. Traditional burial practices could not keep pace with London's rapidly expanding population, and something had to be done. The solution was both practical and unusual: a dedicated railway that could carry coffins and mourners from central London to a newly established cemetery far outside the city. Brookwood Cemetery, located in Surrey, was purchased specifically for this purpose, sprawling over thousands of acres and designed to accommodate millions of graves. To connect the city to this distant resting place, the London Necropolis Railway was inaugurated in 1854. Its London terminus, near Waterloo Station, featured a private station complete with segregated platforms, waiting rooms, and facilities for the handling of coffins. The logistics of the railway were carefully organized. Separate carriages were provided for the dead and the living. Coffins were classified into first, second, and third class, reflecting social status, and corresponding accommodations were offered to family members accompanying them. Embalmed or unembalmed bodies could be transported, and elaborate rituals could be maintained during the journey. The trains ran on a regular schedule, sometimes multiple times per day, effectively functioning as a public service, though one that operated in a realm most citizens would never witness directly. Over time, the Necropolis Railway became a well-known part of London life, a practical response to urban mortality. Its daily operation was quiet, efficient, and remarkably modern for the era. Engineers had to account for the weight and sensitivity of the cargo, ensuring that coffins remained secure during transit. Conductors were trained to handle mourners with discretion, and the railway operated as a somber, yet functional extension of the city's burial infrastructure. The line continued operating into the 20th century, eventually ceasing regular passenger service after World War II, though parts of its tracks and the Brookwood facilities remained for funeral use. Today, The stations have vanished, and the trains no longer run, yet detailed records, maps, and photographs preserve the memory of this extraordinary service. The London Necropolis Railway illustrates a moment when innovation, engineering, and social necessity intersected in a way that seems almost surreal. A ghostly train on a daily schedule, it ferried thousands of people to their final resting places, blending practicality with macabre symbolism. What once seemed like Gothic fiction was, in fact, a strikingly real and historically documented solution to one of London's deadliest problems. Everest fossils. For anyone who has stood at the base of Mount Everest, the idea that the highest point on Earth was once underwater seems almost impossible. Yet the summit, rising over 29,000 feet above sea level, is composed largely of marine limestone, and embedded within it are the fossilized remains of creatures that lived millions of years ago at the bottom of the ocean. For decades, these facts were dismissed or misunderstood because they challenged the intuitive sense of geography and scale that most people carry. How could sea life possibly end up on the roof of the world? The answer lies in the slow, relentless forces of plate tectonics. Around 450 million years ago, the region that now forms the Himalayas was submerged beneath the Tethys Ocean. The seafloor was home to trilobites, brachiopods, crinoids, and other marine organisms, leaving behind a record of their existence in the form of fossils. These layers of sediment, compacted over millions of years, eventually solidified into limestone, preserving the delicate structures of shells and skeletons with remarkable clarity. Approximately 50 million years ago, the Indian tectonic plate began a collision course with the Eurasian plate. The convergence was massive and unrelenting. Unlike simple surface movement, the plates pressed against one another with extraordinary force, crumpling, folding, and thrusting the oceanic rock skyward. The limestone beds that once lay thousands of feet below sea level were forced upward, creating the Himalayas and, eventually, Mount Everest itself. Today, geologists can trace this process in the rock strata, observing layers of marine fossils stacked atop one another, frozen in place hundreds of millions of years after their formation. Early explorers and mountaineers were initially puzzled by the presence of fossils at extreme altitudes. In the 1920s, reconnaissance teams reported trilobite and brachiopod fossils near the Everest base camp, challenging assumptions about geology and paleontology. These discoveries eventually confirmed what plate tectonic theory predicted. The very summit of the planet was once seafloor. The fossils also provided insight into the evolution of marine life, showing species that existed long before the Himalayan uplift occurred. Standing at the peak, it is difficult to reconcile the view of snow, ice, and wind with the ancient marine ecosystem that once existed there. The transformation from seafloor to summit illustrates the immense power of Earth's geological processes. Fossils preserved at 29,000 feet serve as a reminder that landscapes are never permanent and that what we perceive as immovable can, over deep time, be shifted, lifted, and reshaped beyond imagination. The marine fossils on Everest are more than a curiosity. They are evidence of the planet's dynamic history. They prove that even the highest point on Earth was once submerged beneath ocean waves, and that the record of life can endure, even when carried to the extremes of the sky. It is a truth that seems mythic, but science confirms it. The roof of the world was once a seabed. Ancient Pygmies. For centuries, the idea of a race of very small people living deep in Africa was treated as legend by European explorers and writers. Tales of diminutive tribes were often dismissed as fantasy, grouped alongside stories of dwarfs, elves, and other creatures of folklore. To most of the Western world, pygmies existed only in the imagination, a distant curiosity, more story than reality. Yet the ancient Egyptians, over 4,000 years ago, knew otherwise. For them, pygmy peoples were real, documented, and even celebrated. Evidence for this recognition appears in several historical sources, the most notable being a letter attributed to Pharaoh Pepi II, who reigned around 2270 BCE. In this correspondence, Pepe instructs his expedition leaders regarding the treatment of a pygmy brought back from Central Africa. He emphasizes careful handling and rewards for proper conduct, reflecting not only awareness but respect for the individuals involved. The letter suggests that pygmies were valued as performers, particularly dancers, whose presence brought prestige and entertainment to the Egyptian court. Archaeological and artistic evidence further supports this reality. Tomb paintings, reliefs, and statues depict pygmies alongside other peoples of the known world, sometimes participating in dances or rituals, sometimes presented as gifts or attendants. They were not marginalized curiosities. They held recognized roles within Egyptian society and were often associated with divine or ceremonial functions. The Egyptians even engaged in trade networks that included pygmy communities, exchanging goods, animals, and cultural practices. These interactions were formalized and recorded, demonstrating a sustained awareness of the peoples living in regions far beyond the Nile Valley. This recognition contrasts sharply with later European perspectives. When accounts of African pygmy tribes reached the Western imagination in the medieval and early modern periods, they were often dismissed as exaggeration or fantasy. Reports of small, agile people living in dense forests seemed improbable, and the tales were treated as entertaining myth rather than ethnographic fact. Scholars of the Enlightenment era and beyond sometimes catalog them as curiosities rather than acknowledging the continuity of real, living populations. The gap between ancient Egyptian understanding and European skepticism illustrates how cultural context shapes perception. Where the Egyptians documented, depicted, and respected pygmy peoples, later Europeans doubted their very existence. For millennia, what was reality in one civilization became myth in another, misinterpreted through distance, imagination, and lack of direct knowledge. Ultimately, the Egyptian record confirms that pygmy peoples were known, valued, and actively engaged with more than 4,000 years ago. Their presence was neither incidental nor peripheral. It was a recognized part of the wider world. The stories later dismissed as myth were, in fact, accurate accounts, preserved in correspondence, art, and trade records, proving that history can sometimes be stranger than the legends it inspires. Thera Eruption. For millennia, the story of Atlantis has captivated the imagination. Plato described a highly advanced island civilization, wealthy, technologically sophisticated, and morally complex, which was said to vanish beneath the waves in a single day and night of catastrophic destruction. For most of history, scholars treated this as allegory, a moral tale warning against hubris, excess, and corruption. The idea that such a place had actually existed seemed impossible, relegated to myth, legend, and speculation. Yet modern archaeology and geology suggest that Plato's story may have been rooted in a real and devastating historical event. The likely candidate is the eruption of Thera, the island now known as Santorini, in the Aegean Sea. Occurring around 1600 BCE, this volcanic event ranks among the most powerful eruptions in human history. It obliterated the central part of the island, sending enormous volumes of rock, ash, and pyroclastic material into the atmosphere. The force of the explosion triggered tsunamis that swept across the eastern Mediterranean, devastating coastal settlements and reshaping the geography of the region. Archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction in the surrounding islands and the collapse of advanced Bronze Age communities. One of the most affected civilizations was the Minoans, based on Crete. They were an advanced maritime culture with complex palaces, vibrant frescoes, and extensive trade networks spanning the Aegean and beyond. Excavations at sites like Akrotiri on Santorini reveal a city buried under meters of volcanic ash, preserved in remarkable detail. Frescoes, pottery, and buildings provide insight into daily life before the disaster, showing a society capable of extraordinary engineering and artistic achievement. The sudden burial of the city preserved it for millennia, leaving a snapshot of a culture abruptly erased by natural forces. The scale of the eruption helps explain the elements of Plato's story. Witnesses in neighboring regions would have seen enormous ash clouds, earthquakes, and tsunamis. Oral traditions of a once great civilization destroyed by water and fire could have been transmitted across generations, eventually reaching Greek thinkers who recorded it in literary form. The memory of Thera's cataclysm may have fused with imaginative elements to create the enduring legend of Atlantis, an advanced society punished or obliterated by forces beyond human control. Scientific studies support the timeline and magnitude of the eruption. Radiocarbon dating, tephra layers, and geological surveys confirm a sudden, catastrophic event coinciding with the Late Bronze Age. Combined with archaeological evidence from Santorini and Crete, it is clear that a flourishing culture was effectively wiped out, leaving devastation in its wake. Plato's Atlantis may never have existed as a literal island with golden palaces, but the eruption of Thera provides a real-world foundation for the myth. A Bronze Age civilization, technologically advanced for its time, was destroyed in a single catastrophic event, leaving behind stories of a paradise lost to the sea. What was once dismissed as allegory or fantasy may have been a distorted memory of one of history's most dramatic natural disasters, a civilization erased but remembered through legend.